Family and fellow soldiers, I'm the Professor, and this is the Moment of Truth. Carolyn Bryant lived as an animal and died as a criminal. But she wasn't alone, not by a long shot. The two white men who were principally responsible for torturing, mutilating, and murdering a child, then dumping his body in the river, were put on trial. But naturally they were acquitted by their fellow white supremacists. Because the murder of Emmett Till had absolutely nothing to do with defending Carolyn Donham's alleged honor. It had everything to do with white supremacists indulging their sick, perverted whims. These animals kidnapped, mutilated, tortured, murdered a child and dumped the child's body in the river, and then after the acquittal, these white supremacists went on to brag to the white media that they had done it. And as for Carolyn Donham, nothing was done to her at all. She wasn't punished, wasn't even arrested. But there were plenty of others who aided and abetted in the bestial crime of murdering Emmett Till. There is a complicit white supremacist government that has made it a point to protect the race killers who carry out genocides and various crimes against humanity in the United States. There was a warrant issued for Carolyn Donham's arrest for the abduction of Emmett Till. But because she was white, the warrant was never served. The authorities in Mississippi knew all about the warrant, but they refused to serve it. That's an important point. They knew about the warrant, but they refused to serve it. They said, well, she's got some children and we don't want to bother her, because white privilege is the law of the land. And every day ever since, no government at the local, state, or federal level dared to touch her, not because there wasn't evidence, but because both the white right and the white left are in agreement when it comes to the need to use violence as a means of coercing and controlling black people. The murder of Emmett Till was not a tragedy for the majority of Americans. What it was a glorious message being sent to black people that they can be killed with impunity and the killers will be protected, that the bad guys are on code. Emmett Till was kidnapped, he was tortured, mutilated, murdered, and then his body dumped in the river. Now, does anyone believe that it had been two black men who were accused of any one of those crimes, much less all of them? That those guys wouldn't have been dead by sundown? Does anyone believe that if Carolyn Donham had been a black woman who helped and aided in the murder and torture of a white child, that any excuse would have kept her out of handcuffs, much less a prison cell? Does anyone think that if it had been two black men accused of mutilating and killing a white child, that the federal government led by J. Edgar Hoover would not have been able to arrest or charge them? Remember, Jack Johnson became the impetus for the Federal Mann Act, otherwise known as the white slavery law, simply because he had dated a white woman. As those of you who follow the black media know, the arrest warrant for Carolyn Donham was found last year. If the alleged issue was one of a statute of limitations, that could have been easily extended. All it took was some mere accusations against Bill Cosby, and you had states from California to New York changing their laws to extend and in many cases renew the amount of time to go after people for sexual assault and what have you. And it was always black ones who they seemed most interested in going after. Both Republicans and Democrats alike pursued a hands-off policy where this piece of trash Donham was concerned. Up until a few years ago, most people didn't even know that this demonic beast was still alive. They just assumed that after so many decades, it must have died. And when its evil presence was discovered, people began demanding that this creature be punished for its animalistic nature. There were rumors that the original warrant for this creature existed, but of course the white media got on code immediately and began attacking the very notion that the search warrant even existed. And even if it did exist, the white media said, well, it's been so long ago, even though there's no statute of limitations on murder, or in this case, abduction in relation to a murder. The white media didn't even bother to look into it themselves. As soon as they heard that black people were looking to hold a white supremacist accountable for harming a black person, the white media swung into action, and as a group, they began saying it wasn't possible. You can't do it. All of the white media coverage about the possibility of that warrant existing, and I mean all of the coverage, was of a uniformly negative nature. The white media didn't make any pretense that they felt affronted. They themselves felt threatened at the idea that this little white supremacist heifer could actually be held accountable for harming a black child. They seemed to take it personally, and they were on a mission that they were going to stop it. They would only talk to people who said that the warrant didn't exist, and even if it did, it didn't matter because, well, reasons. And then the warrant was found. The white media tried to question its authenticity, but it was soon authenticated. Now that the warrant had been found and authenticated, there was nothing to stop Donham from being arrested except the authorities just flat out refused to do it. They never gave a reason other than, well, it was a long time ago, which is no reason at all. It's the classic I'm white and I say so. You had the case of Amy Cooper, the racist white woman in New York, who was caught on video making a false police report about a black man, and the DA, Cy Vance, said he wasn't going to prosecute her, not because she hadn't committed a crime, but because she has genetic immunity from the law, saying the exact same words sounding just like the sheriff who refused to arrest Carolyn Bryant. When have you ever seen the authorities tell a white family or a white person that they can't go after a black defendant? When have you seen them say, oh, well, there's just nothing we can do? When have you seen the white authorities flat out refuse to arrest a black person accused of a crime because, well, they think that the person being accused was just enough pressure that was enough to be done? They break laws like they did with Cosby to manufacture a case on a black person to put them in prison. You hear almost daily about innocent black men who have been in prison for 20, 30, 40 years or longer based on false accusations and DAs who withhold evidence or fabricate cases. So where was the Congressional Black Caucus at while all this is going on? The black grassroots were talking about that warrant. Where were the Congressional Black Talkers at to go ahead and do a sit-in on the floor of the House of Representatives? Oh, they could do that for the LGBT community. And they were certainly furious and full of righteous indignation when it came to the treatment of illegal alien children down in southern Texas. The illegal minors who were being detained, you had Negroes like Elijah Cummings and Kamala Harris. Oh, they were just so indignant. Full of indignation, I tell you. How could children be treated like this? Meanwhile, Emmett Till, crickets. And that tells you everything you need to know about your black misleadership class. Obviously, we don't have to ask about Merrick Garland. The less said about that scumbag, the better. And now, this demon is dead, which was the entire point. People have known exactly where it was at. This animal was simply allowed to live out its life without anyone attempting to seek justice. We've seen this across the board. There were tens of thousands of black people who were kidnapped and murdered in the period between Reconstruction and the late 60s. There are black people who to this day cannot go back to the cities that they were from because the white supremacists who controlled those places in the 50s and 60s are still in control today. In many cases, those white supremacists who were kidnapping and killing black activists who were committing bombings and such are still alive. Joe Biden was mentored by some of those racist segregationists. And Donald Trump, he considered a number of them to be good friends. These are people who he was on good terms with. So you see that the white right and the white left, when it comes to anti-black racism, there's neither light nor air between them. Carolyn Bryant's not the last one. When you see a pattern of behavior across the board like this, consistent and defying any attempt to change or alter it, then you have to admit this is a policy at work. Everyone from the police to the prosecutors to the courts to the legislators to the white media, they all understand that there is an unspoken rule that if some white supremacist harms a black person, they are not to be punished. That's why, on the very rare occasion that it happens, it makes international news. You can't compare anyone else's minor grievances to the overwhelming oppression that we have to endure every single day. And when these hate criminals murder black people, they are protected by the white media and the government at all levels. The murder of Emmett Till was not just a Mississippi crime. It was a crime carried out by the United States. If Emmett Till had been a white child, and his assailants were two black men and a black woman, hell, if it had been two black men and still a white woman, then if the federal government saw that Mississippi didn't do anything about it, even after the trial was over, if they had made a confession in front of the white media, the federal government would have swooped in and said, we're going to put some charges on you for something. And it wouldn't matter if the doggone warrant was 50 years old, 70 years old, or 1,000 years old. The white media would have been talking to experts saying, oh, how extraordinary this is. This is like the Nazis. We're going after the Nazis. That's the comparisons that would be made. The white media becomes the PR team for these white racist killers, and the government becomes their defense counsel. You do not see any other group treated like this. Asians have never been treated like this in this country. They got a hate crimes law specifically for them. It didn't take an Emmett Till to get it done for them. And it didn't take decades for them to get it either, and they didn't have to march for years on end. They just asked for it once, and it was done. Hispanics have never been treated like this. They said they wanted legal immigration requirements waived. They wanted driver's licenses without having to be here legally. And New York, as well as practically every other major city in America and a number of the states, bent over backwards to make sure they could get it. Now, you had Jews who were persecuted in Germany, but the U.S. government makes sure that if there's any Nazis out there that the U.S. can get its hands on, they get arrested. Trump said that neo-Nazis in Charlottesville were very fine people, and then he handed a Nazi over, the last known Nazi guard in the U.S., to be sent to Germany to stand trial. Oh yeah, the guy had like 1 or 2 teeth left in his mouth. He probably didn't even know what year it was, but he's going to Germany to stand trial anyway. Yeah, with that Nazi that they caught a few years ago, there was nobody talking about paperwork. Nobody in the white media saying, oh, it was such a long time ago. Or, well, is there any evidence that he actually harmed anyone? There was nobody talking like that at all. Nobody trying to raise questions about it or say, well, memories is a long time ago. Nobody's around who remembers it. It's going to be tough. They weren't saying that at all. They were saying he was caught and he's going to get what he deserves. Nobody was saying, well, do you have any evidence that this guy harmed anyone? All that they had to do was say, well, he collaborated with those who did. Kind of like Carolyn Donham, huh? It was Donald Trump's own State Department who issued a statement saying that those who facilitated Nazi crimes and other human rights violations will not find a safe haven on American soil. Yeah, that's because they allowed the anti-black racists to have safe haven here. Because the government and all major media in this country are run and staffed by those very same anti-black racists. They don't tell these other groups that they can't do anything about people who harm them, so this is what you call color-coded law enforcement. This animal was allowed to remain on the loose because the U.S. government saw her freedom as a trophy for white power. And Carolyn Donham wasn't the only racist who committed atrocities here in the U.S. and was allowed to walk around free. There's other war criminals as well, and I call them that because we have been the subjects of a relentless race war for 500 years. And these other criminals are not being punished or even pursued. Not because there's no evidence against them, not because no one knows if the statute of limitations is expired, but because there is a vicious, open policy of protecting the perpetrators of anti-black violence in the U.S. By the way, these criminals are not just in the Deep South either. The draft riots didn't happen in Selma or New Orleans, they happened mostly in the North. Many, if not most of the racial covenant towns were in the North and even out West. The murder of black people in the United States is a sanctioned act, sanctioned by the government. And if you try to punish the killers, you'll find that the harshest opposition to it comes from the U.S. government. Ahmaud Arbery's murder was caught on video. His murderers were put on trial, and that judge tried to cut them every break imaginable during the trial process. Some idiots try to give the judge credit for the sentence, but they fail to understand that Georgia law has some of the strictest mandatory sentences in the country. Those laws were written to expedite the mass incarceration of black people to make it where no matter what, a lighter sentence couldn't be given. Because police routinely refuse to question, arrest, charge, or to try non-black perpetrators. So in the case of Ahmaud Arbery's killers, once they were convicted, the judge didn't really have much leeway to reduce their sentence. But when the Biden White House found out that Ahmaud Arbery's killers had gotten life sentences and that these guys were going to be serving their sentence in those hellish Georgia prisons, that's when the Biden White House did what they thought would simultaneously score them some easy PR points and allowed them to cut the killers a break by saying, well, we're going to charge these guys with something. Oh, you ain't got no charges for the murder of Emmett Till, even though you know exactly where this creature is at. But when it comes to Ahmaud Arbery, all of a sudden, oh, we remember where we put our indictment slips at. We remember where the affidavits are at. But they put aside the pretense and showed their true colors soon enough when Biden's DOJ went behind the backs of Ahmaud Arbery's family to cut the killers a sweetheart plea deal. It was an effort by the Biden DOJ to get them out of those hellish Georgia prisons and make sure they could serve their sentences in a cushy federal prison instead. If you can't keep these guys from going to prison, at least give them the best accommodations possible, right? For all of you Biden bots out there, this is your boy. Now, those killers had already been convicted in state court. So with that hanging over their empty heads, a federal conviction was a slam dunk. So why offer them a plea deal at all? You didn't have to. Why do it? Because the Biden DOJ was pursuing the policy of protecting the perpetrators of anti-black violence. If you can't free them, at least make things as easy for them as possible. This was going to be their way of circumventing that state sentence, put them in a federal prison. And when the family of Ahmaud Arbery challenged the Biden DOJ in court, did Kristen Clark and her cohorts back down and say, oh, well, if the family's against it, we got to make sure we get justice here, so if the family says this isn't just, we won't do it. Is that what happened? No. They had told Ahmaud Arbery's family that they were going to do right by them. It was only at the last minute, though, that the family found out that Biden's DOJ rushed to the courthouse and tried to get the judge to sign off on a plea deal before the family could stop them. They tried to run that doggone plea deal through as quickly as possible, ramrodded through the courts. Kristen Clark and her bootlicking pals had already signed and sealed the agreement. All they needed was for the judge to sign off on it and they would be done. They could go ahead and get Ahmaud Arbery's killers out of those state prisons and put them into some federal country club. But the family of Ahmaud Arbery wasn't having it. They knew exactly what kind of anti-black racist they were dealing with in Biden's DOJ. The family of Ahmaud Arbery dragged a reluctant white media with them to that courthouse. The Biden DOJ was caught out. The judge had no choice but to reject that attempt to derail justice, because that's what that was. It was supposed to be an end run around the Georgia conviction. The Biden DOJ, however, was forced to have to bring the case regardless, which wasn't hard because the case already made itself. And the killers got another conviction, but what they didn't get was to serve their time in a swanky federal country club. They're down in Georgia, doing the hardest time there is. Gregory McMichael, who's the eldest of that inbred gang, he at last report recently was moved to a medical prison in Georgia. His lawyers complaining about the unsafe and unsanitary conditions at the prison that he was previously at, and that his murderous client has a history of stroke and heart disease and anxiety and depression. Oh, poor baby. Tough crap, do your time. But these are the lengths that this country has always gone to protect those who kill black people. Nobody else is subjected to this, and that's why we must have reparations. That's why we're owed it. Now, what is the answer for a people who are inside of a country that allows them to be harmed, targets them, hunts them, kills them, and then the state protects the murderers? What is the answer for a people who are subjected to this treatment by the state? See, you can't compare this to anyone else. When the Jews faced persecution, they were aided in obtaining their own state, and it would never have happened without the diplomacy and political intervention of black Americans like Walter White, who persuaded certain African nations to drop their opposition to the UN recognizing Israel as a state. But even before Israel was formed, the Jews had already formed their own unofficial intelligence gathering and covert ops organizations, their own little networks. Read the book Gideon's Spies to get the lowdown on that, but their problem, of course, was that they were in somebody else's land. They were in somebody else's country. They did not own and control Palestine. The British did. Mostly what was going on prior to 1948 was the Jews wanted some early warning for the next time that some Arabs decided to throw rocks at them if they did a pilgrimage or something. That's mostly what they were doing. But when Israel was formally recognized by the UN as a state, this intelligence and covert ops network that they put together, it changed its mission. Now it went from being just about prevention of harm to actively going after those who did the harm. This network would eventually become the Mossad. The rest of the world had largely moved on from the Nazis and considered the Nuremberg trials to be the end of that matter. Nobody in Europe or the US was looking for the Nazis. And, as we saw with things like Project Paperclip, the U.S. government had brought over 1,000 German scientists, engineers, and technicians from Nazi Germany and put them to work for the U.S. government's Cold War military effort against the Russians. The U.S. government wasn't interested in chasing or punishing the Nazis, but the Israelis were. So they began scouring the earth to capture or kill the ones who had harmed them. But that was only possible because they had a safe haven to operate from. They had a safe place they could go to where even if you knew it was them, you couldn't do anything about it. All of those Nazis running over to South America, literally underneath the U.S. government's nose, but there was no effort by the CIA to go after these guys. The problem wasn't that the Nazis were untouchable. The problem was that the authorities of these countries, including the United States, didn't want to go after them. The reason that South American countries like Argentina and Chile became havens for these Nazis is because those countries also espouse and express the exact same white identity politics that the Nazis had. That's the reason why so many of them went to those places. Argentina bills itself as basically a European country in South America. And when you look at the basket case that Argentina's economy is, you see that they're right. A few years after the Israelis caught Adolf Eichmann, the Europeans were debating a law to place a statute of limitations on the Nazis' crimes. That's what they were doing just 20 years after the Second World War. You had the biggest war in the history of Europe, and only a scant 20 years later, the Europeans were trying to put in place a time limit on how long someone could go after the Nazis. Now, that effort didn't succeed, but even if it had, do you think the Israelis would have played along with that? The Israelis put the resources of their new state to work. They had a safe base of operations from which to carry out their plans. But we here in the United States, that's not going to be an option for us. First of all, we are in the land of the people who are attacking us. The Israelis were not in Germany carrying out their operations for the Mossad, same way that they couldn't do it when they were in Palestine. We don't have some safe haven that we can go to where we can safely plan how to bring those who kill us to justice. We're in the belly of the beast. Secondly, the Nazis were fugitives. Adolf Eichmann couldn't go back to Germany and think that they would protect him. That's why he fled to Argentina. The problem is that the Carolyn Donhams and the rest of these racists, they don't have to flee anywhere. They're not fugitives at all. Because they're being protected by the very countries where they committed their crimes. For those hardheads who say that I give the Israelis too much credit or what have you, please have a seat. I am well aware of exactly what the differences are between the position of the Israelis and black people in the United States. These are people who don't study history, by the way. My point is that there's a very good reason, or rather a number of reasons, why the Israelis were able to capture and take Adolf Eichmann back to Israel, and they didn't have to fear anyone waging war on them or any sort of sanctions or anything else. There was a reason why they could go and kill Herbert Zerkers. That guy was a Latvian who was said to be responsible for the killings of over 30,000 Jews in Latvia. There was a reason why they were able to do these things. Kidnappings, assassinations. The European powers and the United States, they were not protecting the Nazis. They were simply uninterested in them. And the South American regimes that were actually interested in them didn't have the ability to do anything against Israel. But my point is that in order for things like what the Mossad did to actually be feasible, those who carry out such actions have to be sure that they're not going to be attacked by these other countries for doing so. The Americans and the Europeans were not opposed to punishing any straggler Nazis that were out there. And the countries who did oppose it, like Argentina and Chile, they didn't have the ability to punish Israel. When a country knows that someone has committed a crime and then refuses to punish them or to hand them over to those who would, that's because the government of that nation sanctions the actions of that criminal. That's what we're dealing with here in the United States. There are some black people who are lying to themselves, trying to make themselves feel better about the fact that this known accomplice, Carolyn Bryant, was allowed to remain free with the open complicity of the U.S. government. Emmett Till is called a martyr, and he is. But as black people, we don't need more martyrs. What we need is justice. Praising Emmett Till is fine, but praising a dead child doesn't change the fact that the murderer was never punished for killing him. This is not the time for us to be looking for ways to feel better about living under injustice. You are not free unless justice is done, and justice is the righting of a wrong. We have a right to be free, a right to be safe, and a right to justice when we are wronged. The whole world will deny us our rights if they can. The whole world pursues and persecutes us like rabid dogs. Well, the only way to deal with a wild animal chasing you is to at some point turn and face it. Justice doesn't just magically happen. A system of laws means nothing if the people who are supposed to enforce it are criminals themselves, and they use their positions to sanction or initiate violence meant to prevent the people who want justice from having it. This is why we are owed reparations, because the crimes against us didn't stop in 1865, or 1965, or 2008, or even today. We talk about things like the Tulsa Race Massacre, and all these anti-black racists, many of whom aren't white, by the way, tell us that, well, it didn't happen to anyone alive today, so black people just need to let it go. And then when we bring survivors of the Tulsa Race Massacre to Congress, and they demand reparations, you know what those same racists say? Well, it was a long time ago. So they don't say that because that's an actual argument. They say it because they are opposed to black people getting justice in any shape, form, or fashion. Well, we're not playing the statute of limitations game, because these white supremacists don't obey their own laws. They don't have any morals. All they have is moral relativism and situational ethics. For them, what they're willing to call right or wrong depends on whether it will suit their perverted obsession with power. Well, we know what right and wrong is, and our definition doesn't change, because virtue doesn't change, morality doesn't change, justice doesn't change. We won't forget Emmett Till, but what we also won't forget is that this country protected and enabled child killers to remain free. And a bunch of other little Carolyn Donhams are still running around today, because they're allowed to, because they're protected. Emmett Till was not merely kidnapped, heinously tortured, and murdered by a few racists of Mississippi. He was murdered by the United States. Now, what should the punishment be for that? And that's this week's Friday Crime Report. Keep your eyes open and stay on alert, because there's a lot worse criminals out there than the ones the white corporate media chooses to show you, and who the white media and the government works to protect. Good day, and be one.